Every mother dreams of giving her child a better life than she had. For Freydis, a battle-scarred Norse woman with nothing but one silver coin and endless regret, that dream seemed impossible until she found a crumbling longhall at the forest's edge. She bought the ruin for that single piece of silver, hoping to build her son Einar a quiet home far from the violence that had defined her warrior past. But when they began clearing away years of debris and neglect, young Einar's shovel struck something unexpected beneath the old hearthstone. What he pulled from that hidden chamber would change everything. Ancient treasures from a forgotten king's hoard, relics worth more than most villages would see in a lifetime. Word of their discovery spread like winter wind across the northern settlements, drawing dangerous attention from raiders, rival clans, and those who believed might made right. But would this sudden fortune become their salvation or their doom? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the fjord like the breath of sleeping giants, and Freydis Eriksdottir stood at the threshold of what might charitably be called a hall. The structure sagged against itself like an old warrior nursing wounds that would never fully heal. Half the roof had collapsed inward, leaving blackened timbers jutting skyward like the ribs of some ancient beast. Moss grew thick on the remaining thatch, and the great wooden doors hung askew on rusted hinges that groaned with each gust of wind from the water. She pressed the single silver coin between her weathered fingers, feeling its worn edges and the faint impression of a long-dead king's profile. This was all she had left after 3 years of wandering, one coin and a 14-year-old son who deserved better than the life she had given him. "Mother, are you certain about this?" Einar's voice carried the careful tone he used when he thought she might be making another of what he diplomatically called her bold decisions. At 14, he had inherited his father's thoughtful nature rather than her impulsive warrior's heart. A blessing she thanked the gods for daily. "I'm certain that we need a roof over our heads before the snows come," she replied, though her own doubts echoed in the empty spaces of the ruined hall. "And this is what we can afford." The hall had once belonged to a minor jarl named Thorvald the Generous, a man whose generosity, according to village gossip, had extended primarily to his own appetites and the wives of his retainers. 3 years ago, a fever had swept through his household, taking him, his family, and most of his servants. The survivors had fled, leaving the hall to rot like an unburied corpse. Gunnar Ironbeard, the village elder who had agreed to witness the transaction, spat into the frost-hardened earth and shook his grizzled head. "Freydis, I knew your father. He was a good man, an honest trader. He would not want his daughter living in this ruin. My father is dead, as is my husband, as are most of the men I once knew," she said quietly. "This is the world we have now, Gunnar. We make what we can of it." The old man's expression softened. Everyone in Ravensfjord knew her story, though most pretended otherwise. Freydis the Shield Maiden, they had once called her. Freydis the Red, for the colour of her hair and the blood she had spilled in the service of jarls who cared nothing for the lives they spent like silver. She had fought in the great raids, had stood in the shield wall when lesser warriors broke and ran. She had killed men whose names she could no longer remember, for causes that seemed as distant now as the stars. All of that had ended the day Magnus. Her husband fell to a Danish axe on some god-forsaken beach whose name she had forgotten. She had quit the warrior's life that very hour, while his blood was still warm on her hands, and their son wept over his father's body. No more raids, no more glory, no more death, but a reputation forged in blood was not easily set aside, and the weight of her past followed her like a shadow wherever they went. Decent folk crossed themselves when she passed. Mothers pulled their children close. Men who had never held a weapon in anger whispered about the wolf woman and her unnatural strength. "The price is fair," said Bjorn the blacksmith, who owned the hall now through some tangle of debt and inheritance that no one fully understood. He was a thin man with nervous eyes who jumped at loud noises, nothing like the blacksmiths of legend who were supposed to be strong as bears and wise as ravens. 1 silver piece for the hall and all the land from here to the tree line. You'll need to make your own repairs, of course? Of course. Freydis placed the coin in his palm, where it seemed to gleam against his soot-stained skin. Consider it done. Einar stepped closer to her side, and she felt the familiar tightness in her chest that came whenever she was reminded how tall he had grown. Soon he would be a man, and what then? Would he follow his father's path of quiet scholarship, or would the wolf blood that ran in her veins call to him as well? She prayed daily that he would choose the former. We'll need timber for the roof, he said, ever practical. A new rope for the bindings. The hearth will require rebuilding. I can see daylight through the stones. Gunnar nodded approvingly. The boy has sense. That's good. He'll need it living out here. He cast a meaningful look toward the tree line, where the woods grew thick and dark. This place sits at the boundary between the settled lands and the wild. Strange things happen in the deep forest, things that honest folk prefer not to discuss. We are not afraid of strange things, Freydis replied, though she noted the information carefully. A warrior learned to pay attention to local superstitions. They often contained grains of truth that could mean the difference between life and death. As Bjorn hurried away with his payment, counting the coin as if it might vanish from his palm, Freydis and Einar began their first exploration of their new home. The main hall was larger than it had appeared from outside, with space enough for a proper hearth and sleeping areas for a family of 8 or 10. The wooden posts that supported the roof were carved with intricate knotwork in the old style, and despite the damage, she could see that this had once been a place of some dignity. "Look at this," Einar called from near the collapsed hearth. He was kneeling in the debris, brushing dirt from something metallic. "It's a pendant. Thor's hammer, I think, but the chain is broken." Freydis took the piece from his hands, feeling its weight. The silver was tarnished black, but the craftsmanship was fine. A warrior's pendant, perhaps left behind in the flight from the fever. She slipped it into her pouch without comment. Such things could be sold if times grew desperate, and times were always desperate for people like them. They worked until sunset, clearing the worst of the debris from the main hall and testing the soundness of the walls. The stone foundation was solid, laid by craftsmen who understood their trade. The wooden walls would need patching in places, but most of the timbers were still strong. With hard work and careful planning, this could become a real home. As darkness fell, they built a small fire in the broken hearth and shared a meal of hard bread and dried fish. The flames cast dancing shadows on the carved posts, and for a moment, Freydis could imagine the hall as it must have been in better days, filled with light and warmth, with the voices of family and friends echoing from the rafters. "Do you think we can truly make this work?" Einar asked quietly. He was staring into the fire with the thoughtful expression that reminded her so strongly of his father. "A new life, I mean. Away from all the rest of it." She reached across to squeeze his shoulder, feeling the growing strength in his young muscles. "I think we must try," she said. "We have come too far to turn back now." But even as she spoke the words, she felt the familiar weight of her sword where it hung from her belt, hidden beneath her cloak. Some habits died hard, and a warrior's caution was not easily set aside. This hall might become their sanctuary, but the world beyond its walls remained as dangerous as ever. Men would always seek to take what others had built, and peace was a luxury that had to be earned with strength. Outside, the wind rose with the turning of the tide, moaning through the broken places in the roof and stirring the embers of their fire. In the distance, something howled in the deep woods, a sound that might have been a wolf or might have been something else entirely. Freydis listened until the sound faded, then added another piece of wood to the flames. Tomorrow they would begin the work of rebuilding. Tonight they were simply a mother and son sharing warmth against the darkness, dreaming of better days to come. It was enough, she told herself. It had to be enough. 3 weeks had passed since they first set foot in the ruined hall, and the rhythm of honest labor had begun to ease the restlessness that had plagued Freydis for so many years. Each morning brought new challenges. patching holes in the walls, replacing rotted floorboards, clearing debris from rooms that had been abandoned to mice and weather. But there was satisfaction in this work, a peace she had never found in the clash of weapons or the roar of battle. Einar had thrown himself into the restoration with the focused intensity he brought to everything that captured his interest. He had always been a thoughtful child, preferring books to swords when such luxuries were available. But now she watched him measure timbers with the precision of a master carpenter and calculate angles with the skill of a shipwright. Perhaps there was wisdom in starting over, in building something new from the ruins of the old. The morning air carried the scent of coming winter as Einar worked to clear the last of the collapsed stones from around the great hearth. This had been the heart of the original hall, where the family would have gathered for meals and stories, where important guests would have been welcomed with ceremony and generous hospitality. Now it was little more than a pile of blackened rocks and broken mortar. But beneath the rubble, she could see the outline of what it had once been. "Mother, come look at this," Einar called, his voice tight with excitement. He was kneeling beside the hearth's foundation, brushing dirt from something hidden in the stones. "I think there's something strange about these floorboards." Freydis set down the bucket of mortar she had been mixing and crossed to where he knelt. The wooden planks beneath the hearth were different from those in the rest of the hall, older, made from a harder wood, and fitted together with joints so precise that barely a hair could be inserted between them. But more importantly, when Einar pressed down on one particular board, it gave slightly, as if it were not properly secured to the beams beneath. "Help me move these stones," she said, her warrior's instincts suddenly alert. In her experience, men who built hidden spaces usually had good reasons for doing so, and those reasons were rarely innocent. Together, they cleared away the remaining rubble until the suspicious floorboard was fully exposed. Einar produced his eating knife and worked the blade along the edges until he found the concealed catches that held it in place. When the board finally came free, it revealed a cavity beneath, not large, perhaps the size of a man's torso, but deep enough to hold secrets, and secrets it held. The golden raven brooch gleamed like a fallen star against the dark earth, its surface untouched by the tarnish that would have claimed lesser metals. Freydis lifted it carefully, feeling its substantial weight, examining the intricate details of its craftsmanship. The raven's eyes were tiny garnets that seemed to glow with inner fire, and the feathers were so finely wrought that they seemed to stir in the morning breeze. "By Thor's hammer," she whispered, then immediately regretted the oath. She had been trying to leave such language behind, to speak and act like the peaceful woman she hoped to become. Einar leaned closer, his eyes wide with wonder. "Is it real gold?" "Real as sunrise," she confirmed, turning the piece to catch the light. But more important than its material value was the symbol it bore. She knew this raven, had seen its like on banners and shields in the great halls of kings. "This is no simple ornament, my son. This is the raven of King Eric Bloodaxe." The name hung in the air between them, like the echo of distant thunder. Eric Bloodaxe had been dead for decades, but his legend remained as sharp as the day he fell in battle on the moors of England. He had been the last great king of a united Norway, before the realm fractured into competing petty kingdoms and warlords carved up the land like a feast-day roast. But what would one of his treasures be doing here? Einar asked. This was just a minor jarl's hall, wasn't it? Freydis studied the brooch more carefully, noting details she had missed in her first examination. The craftsmanship was royal quality, certainly, but there were other marks as well, scratches and dents that spoke of a hard life, of treasures gathered in haste and hidden in desperate times. Stories say that when Eric fell, his treasure was scattered, she said slowly, pieces of old tales coming back to her. Some claimed it was buried with him, others that his followers divided it among themselves. But there were always rumors of a great hoard that was never found, a king's ransom in gold and silver that vanished like morning mist. She looked around the ruined hall with new eyes, seeing not just a minor jarl's residence, but a potential hiding place, a refuge where desperate men might have stashed their most precious possessions during times of war and chaos. The location made sense, remote enough to avoid casual discovery, but not so isolated as to attract suspicion. "There may be more," Einar said, voicing what she was already thinking. "Perhaps, but we must be careful." She wrapped the brooch in a piece of cloth and tucked it safely away. Such treasures bring attention, and attention brings danger. For now, this must remain our secret. But even as she spoke the words, she noticed movement at the edge of the forest. A figure on horseback, too distant to make out clearly, but positioned where he could observe the hall without being easily seen. As soon as she turned her attention toward him, the rider melted back into the trees, as silently as he had appeared. "Did you see that?" she asked, but Einar was still examining the hidden compartment, running his fingers along its edges in search of other concealed catches. "See what?" "Nothing," she said, though her hand instinctively moved toward her sword hilt. "Nothing important." They spent the rest of the morning working on other tasks, but Freydis found herself glancing frequently toward the tree line. The rider did not reappear, but she had not imagined him. Someone was watching them, and that someone had chosen to remain hidden. In her experience, men who skulked in shadows rarely had good intentions. That evening, as they shared their simple meal by the rebuilt hearth, she found herself studying Einar's face in the firelight. He was growing into his father's features, the strong jaw, the thoughtful eyes, the scholar's high forehead. But there was something of her in him as well, a stubborn determination that would serve him well in the trials ahead, because there would be trials. The brooch hidden in her pack was proof of that. Treasures like that were not lost accidentally, and men did not forget where they had hidden a king's ransom in gold. Someone somewhere knew what lay beneath this hall, and now that they had begun to uncover it, that someone would come looking. She reached across to touch her son's hand. "Einar, I need you to listen to me carefully. Tomorrow we will continue our work on the hall, but we must be more cautious. If anyone comes asking questions about what we've found, we have found nothing. Do you understand?" He nodded, though she could see the questions in his eyes. He was old enough to understand danger, but young enough to still believe that honesty was always the best path forward. She hoped that innocence would not be tested too severely in the days to come. Outside, the wind rose again, carrying with it the scent of snow and the distant howl of wolves. But tonight the sound did not seem quite so wild, quite so random. Tonight, it seemed almost like a signal, a message passed from watcher to watcher in the deep forest. Freydis added another log to the fire and settled back against her bedroll, but sleep would not come easily. Her sword lay within easy reach, and her ears remained alert for sounds that did not belong to the natural rhythm of the night. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, she was certain of that. The only question was whether they would be ready to meet them. The hidden chamber revealed itself slowly, like a flower opening to the morning sun. What had begun as a simple loose floorboard became something far more significant as Freydis and Einar worked with careful patience to expand their excavation. They labored only in the early morning hours, when the mist from the fjord would conceal any unusual activity, and they replaced the covering stones each evening so that casual observers would see nothing amiss. Beneath the golden raven brooch, they found silver coins bearing the profiles of long-dead kings, amber beads the size of robin's eggs, and arm rings worked with intricate patterns that spoke of master craftsmen. But the discovery that made Freydis's blood run cold was the seal ring, a massive piece of worked silver bearing the royal arms of Eric Bloodaxe himself. "This belonged to the king," she whispered, holding the ring up to catch the pale morning light filtering through the rebuilt roof. Not just something made in his honor, but something he wore on his own hand. Einar examined the ring with the scholarly attention he brought to any puzzle that captured his interest. "Look at the wear patterns on the silver," he said. "This was used regularly, not just ceremonial. And see here, along the band, there are scratches that look almost like runes, but worn too smooth to read clearly. The implications were staggering. If the king's own seal ring was here, hidden beneath the floor of a minor jarl's hall, then the scope of the treasure was beyond anything they had imagined. This was not simply the hoard of a successful raider, but a portion of the royal treasury itself, wealth accumulated over generations of conquest and tribute. "We need to understand what we're dealing with," Freydis said. "This is beyond my knowledge." "We should speak to Gunnar." The village elder received them in his own hall, a modest building that reflected his practical nature rather than any desire for grand display. His wife served them ale and fresh bread while he examined the pieces they had brought, his weathered face growing more grave with each artifact he studied. "Where did you find these?" he asked finally, though his tone suggested he already suspected the answer. "Beneath the hearth in our hall," Freydis replied. There was no point in lies. Gunnar had lived in Ravnsfjord for 60 years, and there were few secrets in the village that escaped his notice. The old man set down the royal seal ring and looked at them with the expression of a father about to deliver unwelcome news to his children. "Do you know what you have here?" "Royal treasure from the time of Eric Bloodaxe," Einar said. "But we don't understand how it came to be hidden in Thorvald's hall." Gunnar was quiet for a long moment, staring into the flames of his own hearth, as if seeking guidance from the fire itself. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of old secrets and careful memories. "Thorvald was not always the dissolute fool he became in his later years," he said. "In his youth, he served in the royal household, first as a page and later as a minor functionary in the treasury. When Eric fell and the kingdom began to fracture, many of the royal servants found themselves in possession of treasures they could not safely claim. So he stole them," Freydis asked. "Saved them, more likely." "Those were chaotic times, with every petty warlord claiming a piece of the kingdom for himself. The royal treasures were scattered to prevent any single claimant from using them to legitimize his rule. Thorvald may have been tasked with hiding a portion of the hoard until the political situation stabilized. But it never did stabilize," Einar observed. "No, and eventually Thorvald must have decided that the treasures were safer in the ground than in the hands of any living king. So he built his little hall over them and spent the rest of his life as their unwitting guardian." The full scope of their situation was beginning to dawn on Freydis. They had not simply stumbled upon a forgotten cache of valuables, but upon a piece of Norway's lost heritage, treasures that multiple claimants might legitimately seek, each with their own armies and their own ideas about proper ownership. "Who else knows about this?" she asked. Gunnar's expression grew even more serious. "That depends on how carefully Thorvald guarded his secrets. But royal treasures have a way of attracting attention, even when they're well hidden. There are always those who make it their business to know where such things can be found." Over the next few days, Freydis began to notice changes in the rhythm of village life that confirmed her worst fears. Strangers appeared with increasing frequency, traveling merchants who asked too many questions, pilgrims whose routes seemed unnecessarily circuitous, hunters whose game bags remained conspicuously empty despite their claims of success in the forest. Bjorn the blacksmith had grown increasingly nervous since completing their transaction, jumping at shadows and watching the horizon as if expecting unwelcome visitors. When she encountered him at the village well, he could barely meet her eyes. "Any regrets about selling the hall?" she asked, keeping her tone light and conversational. "No, no regrets," he replied quickly. "Just hope you're finding it suitable for your needs. No problems with the structure, I trust? Nothing unexpected?" The carefully casual nature of his questions confirmed what she had already suspected. Word of their discovery was beginning to spread, carried by whispers and speculation rather than direct knowledge, but spreading nonetheless. That evening, as they worked by lamplight to continue their excavation, Einar paused in his careful brushing of dirt from a newly revealed artifact. "Mother, I've been thinking about what Gunnar said. If this treasure rightfully belongs to the crown, shouldn't we report our discovery to the proper authorities?" Freydis looked up from her own work, seeing in her son's earnest expression the same moral certainty that had made his father such a good man and such a poor politician. And who would those proper authorities be? She asked gently. Eric's line is extinct. The kingdom is divided among a dozen petty jarls who spend more time fighting each other than governing their lands. And the Danish kings grow stronger every year while we tear ourselves apart with internal disputes. Then we keep it? The uncertainty in his voice told her that the simple answer did not satisfy his sense of justice. For now, we protect it, she said, until we understand what forces are moving around us and what claims might be made upon it. This treasure has waited decades to see daylight again. It can wait a little longer while we determine the wisest course. But even as she spoke, she knew that time was running short. The watchers in the forest were growing bolder, and the questions from strangers more direct. Soon they would have to choose between fighting for their discovery and fleeing from it. She only hoped they would be ready when that moment came. The silver dragon torque lay coiled in Einar's palm like a sleeping serpent, its surface etched with designs so intricate they seemed to shift and flow in the lamplight. This was not Norse work. The style was older, more primitive, yet somehow more powerful than the refined craftsmanship of Eric Bloodaxe's era. The dragon's eyes were tiny emeralds that caught the light with an inner fire, and its scales had been worked with such precision that they seemed ready to ripple with the creature's breath. This changes everything, Freydis whispered, taking the torque from her son's hands. The metal was warm to the touch, as if it retained some echo of ancient fires. This predates Eric by generations. This is treasure from the first kings, from the time when the gods walked among men. Their excavation had revealed not just a hidden chamber, but an entire treasure vault that extended far beneath the foundation of the hall. What they had initially taken for a simple hiding place was proving to be a carefully constructed, underground repository, with stone-lined walls and multiple chambers branching off from the central cavity. How deep do you think it goes? Einar asked, peering into the darkness below with the fearless curiosity of youth. Deep enough to hold the wealth of kingdoms, she replied, though the thought brought her no joy. With each new discovery, the weight of their responsibility grew heavier. This was not simply treasure. This was history itself, the accumulated wealth and power of the Norse people across centuries of conquest and trade. But their work had not gone unnoticed in the village. That morning, as she walked to the well for water, Freydis had encountered Astrid Fairhair, one of the few village women who had not crossed herself when greeting a former shield maiden. Astrid was a widow herself, having lost her husband to a Danish raid 3 summers past. And perhaps that shared loss created a bridge between them. Strange things happening lately, Astrid said without preamble as she drew water from the well. Strangers in the forest asking questions. Men who claim to be traders but carry no goods. Pilgrims who know nothing of the shrines they claim to visit. What sort of questions? Freydis asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. About the old hall, about its history. About what might have been left behind when Thorvald died. Astrid's voice dropped to a whisper. There are rumors that you found something valuable up there. Gold, perhaps, or silver from the old days. The confirmation of her fears settled on Freydis like a winter cloak, heavy, necessary, but far from comfortable. And what do these rumors say we should do with such theoretical treasure? Some say you should share it with the village. That finder's law gives the community a claim on anything discovered within its boundaries. Others say you should report it to Earl Gunnar the Red, who styles himself king of this region. But most just whisper and watch, waiting to see what happens next. That evening, as they continued their careful excavation, the weight of watching eyes seemed almost tangible. Every sound from the forest might be a footstep, every shift of shadow might conceal an observer. Freydis found herself checking and rechecking the positions of her weapons, the old habits of a warrior reasserting themselves despite her desire for peace. Mother, Einar said quietly, as he worked to free another artifact from its resting place. I think someone was here today, while we were in the village. The chill that ran down her spine had nothing to do with the autumn air seeping through the repaired walls. What makes you say that? The stones we use to cover the excavation, they're not quite in the same positions as we left them. And there are footprints in the dirt, too large to be yours or mine. Freydis examined the evidence he pointed out, and her trained eye confirmed his suspicions. Someone had indeed been here, someone who knew enough to be careful, but not quite careful enough to avoid leaving traces. The intruder had covered the entrance to the vault and arranged the stones to appear undisturbed. But small details betrayed their presence. A smudge of mud where no mud should be. A slight displacement of the covering stones. The faintest impression of a boot sole in the earth. From now on, we work in shifts, she decided. One of us always remains here to guard what we've found. And we accelerate our excavation. If others know about the treasure, we need to understand its full scope before they decide to take it from us. The next morning brought an encounter that crystallized all of her fears. As she worked to repair a section of the hall's outer wall, a group of children from the village appeared at the forest's edge, drawn by curiosity about the ruined hall and its new occupants. They approached with the bold innocence of youth, chattering about games and asking if they could explore the old building. "I'm sorry," Freydis told them gently, "but the hall is not safe for exploring. Too many loose stones and rotten timbers. Perhaps when the repairs are complete, you can visit properly." Most of the children accepted this explanation and wandered off to find other diversions. But one boy, the blacksmith's youngest son, lingered behind with the persistence of a hound on a scent. "My father says you found treasure," he announced with the blunt honesty of childhood. "He says there's gold buried under your house, and that's why all the strangers keep coming to ask questions." "Your father talks too much," she replied, but not unkindly. The boy was perhaps 8 years old, too young to understand the dangers his innocent words might bring. "Are you going to be rich now? Are you going to move to a big city and live in a proper hall with servants and everything?" The question struck her with unexpected force. Here was a child imagining the life that such wealth might buy. Security, comfort, respect, all the things that gold could purchase if one knew how to spend it wisely. But she also knew that such dreams came with a price, and that price was usually measured in blood. "Wealth brings its own troubles," she told him. "Sometimes it's better to have just enough than to have too much." The boy looked puzzled by this adult wisdom. But before he could ask more questions, Einar appeared from inside the hall, carrying an armload of timber for their ongoing repairs. The sight of him seemed to remind the child that there were other adventures to pursue, and he scampered off toward the village with the boundless energy of youth. "How much do you think the entire village knows by now?" Einar asked as they watched the boy disappear into the distance. "Enough," Freydis replied grimly. "More than enough." That night she spent long hours staring into the flames of their hearth fire, weighing their options and finding all of them wanting. They could flee, abandoning both the treasure and their dreams of a peaceful life. They could try to buy safety by sharing their discovery with the local earl, or they could stand and fight for what they had found, knowing that their enemies would outnumber them and outweigh them in both weapons and experience. None of these choices appealed to her, but she was beginning to understand that choice itself might soon be taken from them. Forces were moving in the darkness beyond their hall, and those forces would not be satisfied with rumors and speculation much longer. The time for hiding was almost over. Soon they would discover whether the peace she sought was strong enough to survive the storm that was coming. The monk arrived with the morning mist, his brown robes dark with moisture, and his staff tapping against the frost-hardened earth as he approached the hall. "Brother Aldrich," he introduced himself, a man of learning from the monastery at Nidaros, who claimed scholarly interest in the historical significance of abandoned settlements. His Latin was flawless, his knowledge of local history impressive, and his eyes far too shrewd for a simple seeker of knowledge. "I have heard tales of this hall," he said, as Freydis served him the weak ale that was all their hospitality could provide. "Built on the ruins of an older structure, they say, with foundations that date back to the earliest days of the kingdom." "Every hall in these lands has old foundations," she replied carefully. "Stone endures longer than the men who lay it." Brother Aldrich smiled with the practiced warmth of a man accustomed to extracting information from reluctant sources. Indeed, but this particular hall has attracted considerable attention of late. Travelers speak of strange lights seen at night, of unusual activity around the old hearth. Such tales intrigue a humble scholar like myself. Einar, who had been quietly working on a piece of wood carving, looked up with genuine interest. Despite all her warnings about caution, her son still possessed the dangerous innocence of youth when it came to matters of learning and scholarship. "Are you familiar with the legends surrounding King Eric Bloodaxe?" the monk asked, his question directed toward Einar, but his attention carefully focused on Freydis. "Particularly the stories concerning his lost treasure? Every child knows those tales," Freydis said before her son could respond, "but children's stories rarely survive contact with adult reality." But sometimes reality exceeds even the wildest tales. The monk reached into his robes and produced a small object wrapped in fine cloth. When he unfolded the fabric, it revealed a golden drinking horn no larger than her thumb, exquisitely crafted with tiny runes etched around its rim. This was found in a royal tomb in Denmark, alongside artifacts that prove it belonged to King Sweyn Forkbeard himself. But notice the craftsmanship. This is not Danish work. Freydis examined the miniature horn without touching it, noting the distinctive Norse patterns in the metalwork. Stolen goods often travel far from their original homes, or gifts exchanged between royal houses to seal important alliances, the monk suggested. The runes tell an interesting story. They speak of a treasure divided, hidden away, until a worthy heir should reclaim it. The jeweled drinking horn gleamed in the morning light, filtering through their repaired roof. Its surface worked with intricate designs that seemed to move and shift as the shadows changed. This was clearly a piece of royal regalia, something that would have graced the high table of a king's hall during the most important ceremonies. The tiny garnets set into the rim caught the light like drops of blood, and the gold itself was so pure it seemed to glow with inner fire. "A fascinating artifact," Freydis said, though every instinct screamed warnings about the monk's true purpose. "But I failed to see what connection it might have to our humble hall." Brother Aldrich carefully rewrapped the horn and tucked it back into his robes, but his eyes never left her face. "Perhaps no connection at all. But there are those who believe that when the kingdom fell into chaos, loyal servants scattered the royal treasures to prevent them from falling into unworthy hands. Some say these treasures were marked with signs, cursed to bring misfortune to any who would claim them for base purposes. And what would constitute worthy purposes?" Einar asked, his scholarly curiosity overriding his mother's obvious desire to end this conversation. The monk's smile grew warmer, more paternal. "The reunification of the kingdom, perhaps. The restoration of rightful authority over these fractured lands. There are those who believe that the treasures themselves will choose their new guardians, that they will reveal themselves only when the time is right for Norway to be whole again." Freydis felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. This was no simple scholar seeking knowledge for its own sake. This was a political agent, someone working on behalf of a claimant to royal authority. The carefully casual questions, the display of the golden horn, the talk of curses and worthiness, all of it was designed to gauge their knowledge and test their reactions. "Interesting theories," she said. "But we are simple folk trying to make a life from honest labor. We have little interest in the games of kings and kingdoms." "Of course not," Brother Aldrich agreed, though his tone suggested he believed otherwise. "Still, should you ever encounter anything unusual in your renovations, old artifacts perhaps, or chambers that seem to have been deliberately concealed, I hope you would consider consulting someone with expertise in such matters." He rose to leave, but paused at the threshold as if struck by a sudden thought. "Oh, and should any other visitors come asking similar questions, you might mention that Brother Aldrich of Nidaros has already examined this site thoroughly and found nothing of significance. Such information might save you from unnecessary interruptions." After the monk disappeared into the morning mist, Freydis and Einar sat in troubled silence, each lost in their own thoughts about the implications of this visit. The pretense of scholarly interest had been paper-thin, and the warnings about curses and worthiness had carried undertones that left no doubt about the seriousness of their situation. "He knows," Einar said finally. "Maybe not the details, but he knows we've found something important." "Yes," she agreed. "And he's not the only one. That little performance with the drinking horn was meant to tell us that whoever sent him already possesses royal artifacts of their own. They're not seeking treasure for its material value, they want legitimacy." That afternoon, as they worked to uncover more of the hidden chamber, they discovered artifacts that made Brother Aldrich's golden horn seem modest by comparison. The jeweled drinking horn they found was large enough for a grown man's hands, its silver surface inlaid with precious stones and worked with scenes of legendary heroes. But more disturbing were the runes carved into its base, warnings about the curse that would befall anyone who claimed these treasures without royal blood to justify the taking. "Do you believe in such curses?" Einar asked as he studied the ancient warnings. Freydis considered the question seriously. She had seen enough of the world to know that some forces operated beyond human understanding. But she had also learned that men were quite capable of creating their own disasters without supernatural assistance. "I believe that men who hide treasures often spread tales of curses to discourage thieves," she said. "But I also believe that some objects carry the weight of their history, and that weight can be heavier than gold." As evening fell, she noticed that the usual sounds from the forest had changed. The normal chorus of birds and small animals had fallen silent, replaced by an occasional rustling that might have been wind but felt more purposeful. Someone was watching them again, but this time the observation felt less casual, more organized. "Pack the most important pieces," she told Einar as they covered their excavation for the night. "Choose items that are valuable but also portable. We may need to leave quickly if circumstances require it. Are we fleeing?" There was no fear in his voice, only the practical concern of someone who had learned to adapt to changing situations. "We are preparing for possibilities," she corrected. "The wise warrior always knows where the nearest exit lies." But even as she spoke the words, she knew that flight might no longer be an option. The forces moving around them were too organized, too well-informed. Brother Aldrich's visit had been a test, and their failure to provide satisfactory answers would bring more serious attention. Soon, they would have to choose between surrendering their discovery and defending it with whatever strength they possessed. The drinking horn's curse suddenly seemed less like ancient superstition and more like a prophecy about to be fulfilled. The runic stone emerged from the deepest chamber like a prophecy carved in granite, its surface covered with symbols that seemed to writhe and shift in the lamplight. And like the runes on the drinking horn, which had been etched with the precise hand of a court scribe, these markings bore the rough urgency of a final message, words carved by someone who knew his time was running short. Einar traced the ancient symbols with his finger, his young face grave with concentration as he worked to decipher their meaning. His education had been sporadic, interrupted by their years of wandering, but his father had taught him the old writing before his death, and the boy had a natural gift for languages that impressed even learned men. "It's a warning," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper, "but also a confession. Listen to this. I, Thorvald Eriksson, guardian of the sacred hoard, do set down this record in the year of our Lord's grace, 963. The treasures I have hidden were stolen from the grove of the old gods, taken in a time of war when desperate need drove good men to evil deeds." Freydis felt her blood chill as the implications became clear. The treasure they had been uncovering was not simply royal wealth hidden during political chaos. It was sacred gold, artifacts that had been consecrated to the ancient gods and protected by powers far older than any earthly king. "Go on," she said, though part of her dreaded what they might learn. Einar continued reading, his voice growing more troubled with each line. The gods have marked these treasures with their anger. Already the curse works upon me. My family sickens, my cattle die, my crops fail in the field. I've tried to return the gold to its rightful place, but the grove lies under Danish axes, and the priests who might intercede are scattered or dead. So I commit these cursed treasures to the earth, praying that whoever finds them will prove wiser than I, and return them to the gods' keeping before the curse can spread further. The silence that followed was heavy with more than just the weight of ancient words. Around them, the familiar sounds of their restored hall seemed suddenly ominous. The settling of timbers might be the groaning of tormented spirits. The whisper of wind through the thatch might carry the voices of angry gods. That explains the fever, Freydis said slowly. The plague that killed Thorvald and his household. He believed the treasure brought it upon them. But surely you don't believe in such superstitions? Einar asked, though his voice carried less certainty than his words suggested. Before she could answer, the sound of approaching horses cut through the evening air. Multiple riders, moving with the disciplined pace of trained warriors rather than the casual gait of travelers. Freydis motioned for silence and moved to peer through one of the repaired windows. 6 men on horseback approached the hall, their mail shirts gleaming in the fading light and their weapons clearly visible despite their attempt to appear peaceful. At their head rode a figure she recognized with growing dread, Olaf, the Oathbreaker, a minor jarl whose ambitions far exceeded his abilities, but whose cruelty was legendary throughout the region. Freydis Eriksdottir, Olaf called, as his party drew up before the hall. "We would speak with you." She stepped outside to meet them, noting their positions and the way they had arranged themselves to block any escape route toward the forest. These were not men seeking casual conversation. This was a carefully planned confrontation. "Lord Olaf," she said, inclining her head with the minimal courtesy due to his rank. "What brings you to our humble hall?" The jarl was a thin man, with the pale complexion of someone who spent more time in counting houses than on battlefields, but his eyes held the cold calculation of a merchant evaluating valuable goods. "I think you know why I am here," he said. "Word has reached me of certain discoveries made during your restoration work. Discoveries of considerable historical significance." "We have found many things," she replied carefully. "Old nails, broken pottery, the usual debris left by previous occupants. Nothing that would interest a man of your standing." Olaf's smile was as cold as winter iron. "Come now, there is no need for such modesty. The learned brother Aldrich has shared fascinating details about your recent archaeological endeavors. Royal artifacts, he tells me. Treasures that rightfully belong to the crown, and therefore to those who serve as the crown's representatives in these lawless times." So the monk had indeed been in Olaf's service, sent to confirm the rumors before his master made his move. Freydis found herself calculating odds and angles, noting which of the mounted warriors seemed most dangerous and which might hesitate if violence erupted. "Even if such artifacts existed," she said, "what claim would you have to them? Your family has no royal blood, and your oath of loyalty is to whoever pays the highest price." The insult struck home, bringing spots of color to the jarl's pale cheeks. "My claim is that of strength over weakness, of order over chaos. These are troubling times, woman. Treasures that fall into the wrong hands might be used to fund rebellion, to support pretenders who would drag our land back into civil war. And treasures in your hands would naturally be used for the common good. They would be used wisely by men who understand the delicate balance of power in this region." His tone grew harder, more threatening. "I offer you a choice, Freydis. Surrender what you have found. Accept generous compensation for your discovery and continue your peaceful life here under my protection. Or face the consequences of defying lawful authority." Behind her, she heard the soft sound of Einar moving to a better position inside the hall. Good, the boy was learning to think tactically, to prepare for violence, even while hoping to avoid it. "And if I choose neither of your generous options?" she asked. Olaf's hand moved to rest on his sword hilt, and his warriors shifted in their saddles with the restless energy of men anticipating action. "Then you will learn why they call me the Oathbreaker. I have no patience for those who mistake my reasonable offers for weakness. The runic stone's warnings echoed in her mind as she faced this moment of decision. The curse of stolen sacred gold, the price of defying divine will, the blood that seemed to follow these ancient treasures wherever they went. Perhaps the gods were indeed angry, and perhaps that anger would consume anyone who tried to claim their gold. But if that was true, then men like Olaf were even less worthy than she to bear such a burden. The cursed treasures of the gods deserved better guardians than oath-breaking jarls who saw only material wealth where others might see sacred trust. "I will consider your offer," she said finally. "But such important decisions require time and prayer. Return tomorrow at sunset, and I will give you my answer." Olaf studied her face for a long moment, perhaps trying to determine whether this was genuine consideration or merely a delaying tactic. Whatever he saw there, he apparently decided that one more day would not significantly alter his position. "Very well," he said. "Until tomorrow, then. But do not mistake my patience for weakness, Freydis. There are limits to my generosity, and you would be wise not to test them." As the riders disappeared into the growing darkness, Freydis knew that the time for hiding had finally ended. Tomorrow would bring a reckoning, and she could only hope that when it came, she would prove worthy of the trust that fate had placed in her hands. The iron crown fragment lay in Gunnar's weathered hands like a piece of fallen sky, its dark metal inscribed with runes so ancient that even learned men struggled to decipher their meaning. But there was no mistaking the royal symbols worked into the iron: the raven, the wolf, and the great tree that represented the world itself. This was not merely a piece of royal regalia, but a fragment of the very crown worn by the first kings of Norway, the legendary rulers who had united the scattered tribes under a single banner. "Where did you find this?" Gunnar asked, though his voice carried the weight of a man who already knew the answer would change everything. "In the deepest chamber," Freydis replied. "Hidden beneath stones that had not been moved for generations." The old village elder set the crown fragment carefully on his table and walked to his shuttered window, peering out into the darkness as if checking for unwelcome observers. When he turned back to face them, his expression carried the gravity of a man about to reveal secrets he had hoped to take to his grave. "There is something I must tell you both," he said. "Something I should have shared from the beginning, but I hoped—" He shook his head, as if dismissing old dreams as futile. "I hoped the treasures would remain hidden forever, that the burden of guardianship would pass to others after my death." Einar leaned forward, his scholar's instincts alerting him to the significance of this moment. "Guardianship!" Gunnar returned to his seat and picked up the crown fragment again, turning it slowly in the lamplight. "My true name is not Gunnar Ironbeard, though I have worn it so long that I sometimes forget the man I was before. I am Gunnar Eriksson, former captain of King Eric Bloodaxe's household guard, sworn protector of the royal treasury, and the last living man who knows the full extent of what lies hidden beneath your hall." The revelation struck them like a physical blow. Freydis felt the world shift around her as pieces of a vast puzzle suddenly clicked into place. Gunnar's military bearing, his intimate knowledge of the hall's history, his calm acceptance of her warrior background despite the suspicion it generated in others. "You've been protecting the treasure all these years," she said. "Living here, watching over it, making sure it remained hidden." "For 43 years, he confirmed. "Ever since the night King Eric fell in England, and word came that the Danish armies were marching north to claim his kingdom. We had perhaps 6 hours before the royal hall would be overrun, 6 hours to save what we could of Norway's heritage." His voice grew distant as old memories reasserted themselves. "The king's son was already dead, killed in the same battle that claimed his father. The royal line was extinct. The great jarls were choosing sides based on personal advantage rather than loyalty, and foreign armies were carving up our homeland like a feast day boar. So we made a choice. We scattered the royal treasures to prevent them from legitimizing false claims or funding further warfare." "How much of the treasury did you save?" Einar asked. Gunnar's smile was grim. "More than you might imagine. The chamber beneath your hall contains the founding treasures of the kingdom, artifacts that belonged to Harold Fairhair himself, crown jewels that witnessed the birth of our nation. But there are other caches as well, hidden in locations known only to those of us who swore the sacred oaths. Other caches? Freydis felt a chill of premonition. How many others? 12 in total, each containing a portion of the royal hoard, each guarded by men like myself who accepted exile and anonymity in service to the crown. His expression grew more grave. But I fear I am the last. One by one, my brother guardians have died, taking their secrets to the grave. The treasures they protected lie forgotten and undefended, while pretenders and oath-breakers grow bolder in their claims to royal authority. The full scope of their situation was beginning to dawn on Freydis. They had not simply discovered a hidden treasure, but had stumbled upon the last intact repository of Norway's royal heritage, artifacts that could legitimize the rule of whoever possessed them, or fund the armies needed to reunite the fractured kingdom. This is why Olaf wants the treasure, she realized. Not for its material value, but for what it represents. With royal regalia to support his claims, he could style himself as more than a petty jarl. Olaf is a fool and a coward, Gunnar said dismissively. But he serves more dangerous masters. Word has reached me that Prince Magnus the Good has landed in Denmark with an army of mercenaries, claiming to be the rightful heir to his grandfather's throne. He seeks the royal treasures to legitimize his invasion, and men like Olaf scramble to curry favor with any claimant who might reward their loyalty. Then we cannot let the treasure fall into anyone's hands, Einar said with the moral certainty of youth. If it belongs to the crown, it should remain hidden until a true king emerges to claim it. Gunnar studied the boy with approval, seeing in him something that gave the old guardian hope, spoken like a true protector of the realm. But the time for hiding may be ending, young scholar. Forces are moving that will not be satisfied with rumors and speculation. Soon we must choose between surrendering the treasures to unworthy claimants or defending them with our lives. Then we defend them, Freydis said, her warrior's instincts finally accepting what her peaceful dreams had tried to deny. We stand and fight for what we believe is right. But Gunnar's next words shattered even that simple resolution. There is one more thing you must know, he said, his voice heavy with reluctance. The crown fragment you found, it is not merely a piece of royal regalia. According to the old laws, whoever possesses it has the right to claim kingship over all Norway, provided they can prove themselves worthy through trial by combat. The implications were staggering. Einar, as the discoverer of the fragment, now held a legitimate claim to the throne of Norway, a claim that would be recognized by traditionalists and scholars, even if it might not be accepted by those who preferred to settle succession through force of arms. That's impossible, Einar protested. I'm just a boy. I have no royal blood, no army, no experience in statecraft. Kings are made, not born, Gunnar replied. Harold Fairhair was a minor jarl's son when he began his conquest of the scattered tribes. What made him king was not his bloodline, but his vision of what Norway could become and his willingness to sacrifice everything to achieve that vision. Freydis looked at her son with new eyes, seeing not the scholarly boy she had tried to protect from the world's violence, but a young man who might carry the weight of a kingdom's destiny. The idea terrified her more than any army of warriors ever could. Even if such a claim were legitimate, she said, what army would follow a 14-year-old boy? What jarls would bend the knee to someone they see as a peasant woman's son? The army would follow whoever proves themselves worthy of the crown, Gunnar said. And worthiness is not measured in bloodlines or battle scars, but in wisdom, courage, and the ability to inspire others to greatness. As if summoned by his words, the sound of approaching horses reached them through the shuttered windows, not the measured pace of Olaf's patrol, but the thundering hoofbeats of riders in urgent haste. Gunnar moved quickly to extinguish most of the lamps, leaving only enough light to see by, while concealing their presence from outside observers. More visitors, Freydis said grimly. And I suspect these will be less inclined toward negotiation than Olaf was. Through a crack in the shutters, they could see torches moving through the forest, not just a few riders, but what appeared to be a significant force deployed in a careful search pattern. Someone had decided that subtlety was no longer necessary, that the time had come for direct action. "They're surrounding the village," Gunnar observed with the tactical eye of an old soldier. "This is not a raid, it's a siege. They mean to take the treasure tonight, and they're prepared to kill anyone who stands in their way." Freydis felt the familiar cold calm that preceded battle settling over her like armor. The peaceful life she had sought was ending, swept away by forces beyond her control. But perhaps that was as it should be. Perhaps some things were worth fighting for, even if that fight meant returning to the violent world she had tried so hard to leave behind. "Then we give them a fight they won't forget," she said, her hand moving instinctively to her sword hilt. "Tonight we learn whether the crown chooses its bearer, or whether the bearer must prove worthy of the crown." The royal war sword lay across Gunnar's table like a sleeping dragon, its blade still bright despite centuries in the earth, its edge keen enough to part a hair drawn across its surface. The pommel bore the royal seal of Eric Bloodaxe, but the craftsmanship spoke of an even more ancient lineage. This was Gram reborn, the god-touched blade that chose its wielder rather than being chosen. "This sword has tasted the blood of kings and kingmakers," Gunnar said, as Einar lifted it reverently from its resting place. "It was forged in the dragon's fire when the world was young, blessed by the gods themselves, and carried by every true king of Norway since Harald Fairhair first united the tribes under a single banner." The weapon felt alive in Einar's hands, perfectly balanced despite its substantial weight, warm to the touch as if it retained some echo of ancient battles. But more than its physical perfection, the sword carried an almost tangible sense of destiny, of power that transcended mere metal and steel. "Can you feel it choosing you?" Gunnar asked quietly. "The sword knows its rightful bearer. It will serve no man who lacks the strength to wield it worthily." Outside, the sounds of preparation filled the night air as three separate forces converged on the small village of Ravnsfjord. From the east came the legitimate claimant, Prince Magnus the Good, with his disciplined mercenaries and righteous banner. From the west approached the usurper, Earl Gunnar the Red with his battle-hardened veterans and dreams of stolen glory. And from the north, like wolves scenting blood, came the Viking raiders, who cared nothing for political legitimacy and everything for the treasures that might be won through violence. Freydis stood at the window of their hall, now fortified with the hasty but effective preparations of an experienced warrior. Barricades blocked the doorways, weapons lay within easy reach, and escape routes had been mapped and cleared. But she knew that all their preparations might prove futile against the forces arrayed against them. 3 armies, she said to Gunnar as he finished checking their defenses, each believing they have rightful claim to what we've found. How did word spread so quickly? The old guardian's expression was grim. Royal treasures have a way of calling to those who would be kings. Perhaps it is the god's will that this matter be settled in blood rather than secrecy. Einar emerged from the hidden chamber, carrying a bundle wrapped in ancient silk. The most precious artifacts from the hoard, the pieces that would prove his claim should he live long enough to present them to proper authorities. The Iron Crown fragment rested in a place of honor, but surrounding it were other treasures that spoke of legitimacy, spanning generations. Royal seals, ceremonial weapons, and documents bearing the signatures of long-dead kings. "If we cannot hold this place," he said with a composure that made his mother proud and terrified in equal measure, "at least we can ensure that the most important pieces survive to serve their proper purpose." But Gunnar shook his head. "The treasures stay together, boy. To scatter them now would be to admit defeat before the battle has even begun. We hold this ground or we die defending it. There is no middle path for guardians of the crown." Astrid arrived as the first torches appeared at the forest's edge, bringing with her a small group of villagers who had chosen to stand with them rather than flee into the night. They were not warriors, A blacksmith, a carpenter, 2 fishermen, and a handful of others whose lives had been touched by Freydis's quiet kindness during their brief time in Ravensfjord. But they carried whatever weapons they could find, and their faces bore the determination of people defending their home. "The women and children have been taken to the caves above the fjord," Astrid reported. "They will be safe there until this madness ends. And you should be with them," Freydis said. "This is not your fight. Any fight that threatens the peace of our village becomes our fight," the widow replied with quiet dignity. "Besides, someone must bear witness to what happens here tonight. If we fall, the world should know that we chose to stand for what was right." From outside came the sound of horns, not the random calls of raiding bands, but the organized signals of armies deploying for battle. Prince Magnus had arrived with his disciplined force, taking position on the high ground to the east where his archers could command the approaches to the hall. Earl Gunnar the Red had seized the village proper, using the buildings as cover while his warriors prepared for assault. And the Viking raiders had spread through the forest like a pack of hunting wolves, ready to strike wherever weakness appeared. "They're waiting," Gunnar observed. "Each force hoping another will make the first move and bear the cost of breaking our defenses." It was sound strategy from their enemy's perspective, but it also provided an opportunity. If the attacking forces remained divided by mutual suspicion, they might be played against each other long enough for some other solution to emerge. "Send a message to Prince Magnus," Einar said suddenly. "Tell him that we wish to negotiate an honorable surrender of the treasures to their rightful owner." Freydis looked at her son with alarm. "Einar, we cannot simply hand over the crown to the first claimant who appears. I'm not planning to surrender," he replied with a smile that reminded her strongly of his father's ability to find unexpected solutions to impossible problems. "But I am planning to force them to prove their worthiness before witnesses. The old laws are clear. Royal treasures may only be claimed through trial by combat, and such trials must be conducted according to ancient custom." Gunnar's eyes lit with understanding. "You mean to invoke the right of challenge? Clever, boy. Very clever indeed. The ancient law was rarely invoked in these modern times, but it remained valid in the eyes of tradition-minded folk. Any claimant to royal treasure could be challenged to prove their worthiness through single combat, with the gods themselves serving as judges of the outcome. It was a dangerous gambit. If Einar lost such a trial, they would forfeit not just the treasures, but their lives as well. But it also offered a chance to expose the character of their enemies, and perhaps rally support from those who still believed in honor and justice. "The message must be sent to all 3 forces," Einar continued. "Let each claimant know that the treasures are available, but only to one who can prove himself worthy of them through trial by combat. Let them choose among themselves who will face me, or let them settle their own disputes first." It was a bold plan that might buy them time, but Freydis could not shake her maternal terror at the thought of her son facing seasoned warriors in single combat. She had trained him in the basics of sword work, but he was still more scholar than fighter, more thinker than killer. "Are you certain about this?" she asked quietly. "There can be no retreat once the challenge is issued." Einar's hand rested on the royal sword's hilt, and for a moment she saw not her teenage son, but the ghost of future kings, men who had faced impossible odds with nothing but courage and faith in their cause. "The sword chose me." "Mother," he said simply, "perhaps it's time to trust in that choice." As if responding to his words, the blade seemed to hum with anticipation, its steel catching the firelight and throwing it back in patterns that looked almost like runes. Outside, the 3 armies continued their careful positioning, each waiting for the perfect moment to strike. But inside the hall, destiny itself seemed to be stirring, ancient powers awakening to judge the worthiness of those who would claim dominion over the sacred treasures of Norway. Gunnar began preparing the formal challenges that would be carried to each camp, documents written according to the old formulas, and sealed with wax that contained fragments of the royal seal. These were not mere messages, but legal instruments that would bind all parties to honor the outcome of trial by combat. Once these are delivered, he warned, there will be no turning back. The gods themselves will witness what follows, and their judgment will be final. Freydis looked around the hall that had become their home, seeing it now as it might appear to future generations, not just a place where treasure was found, but where the fate of a kingdom was decided. The thought filled her with equal measures of pride and terror. Then let the gods witness courage, she said. Let them see that some things are worth fighting for, even when the odds seem impossible. The challenges were prepared, the weapons made ready, and the defenders took their positions. Outside, 3 armies waited in the darkness, each certain that victory was within their grasp. But inside the hall, a mother watched her son prepare to claim a crown that might cost him his life. While ancient powers stirred in response to the approaching trial, dawn would bring the final test of worthiness, and with it the answer to a question that had haunted Norway for generations: who was truly fit to wear the crown of kings? The shield of the first king materialized from the dawn mist like a vision sent by the gods themselves, its surface gleaming with inlaid silver that depicted the great tree of life surrounded by the beasts of legend. This was no ordinary war shield, but a relic of the founding days, crafted when the world was young and the gods walked among mortals. As Einar lifted it from its resting place in the deepest chamber, the shield seemed to recognize its new bearer, growing lighter in his hands while somehow becoming more substantial, as if it existed in multiple realms simultaneously. The shield chooses its bearer as surely as the sword does, Gunnar said with reverence bordering on awe. Legend says it cannot be pierced by any weapon wielded with evil intent, that it turns aside not just physical blows, but the malice behind them. The battle began with the sunrise, not as a coordinated assault, but as a 3-way clash of competing ambitions that turned the peaceful village into a maelstrom of violence. Prince Magnus led his disciplined mercenaries in a charge from the eastern hills, their formation tight and their purpose clear. They sought to claim the treasures through legitimate conquest. But Earl Gunnar the Red had anticipated this move, and his veterans met the prince's men with a wall of shields and spears that spoke of decades of hard-won experience. Meanwhile, the Viking raiders struck from the forest like wolves among sheep, caring nothing for the political complexities that motivated the other forces. They sought only blood and gold, and they fell upon anyone who stood between them and their prizes with the savage joy of men who lived for violence itself. Freydis found herself fighting not just for the treasures or even for her son's claim to the throne, but for the very survival of everyone she had come to care about in this small village. Her sword sang as it cut through the morning air, each stroke guided by the muscle memory of countless battles and the desperate fury of a mother protecting her child. But this was different from the raids of her youth. Now she fought not for glory or plunder, but for something that transcended personal gain. Bjorn the blacksmith fought beside her with hammers that rang like thunder against enemy shields, while Astrid defended the hall's rear entrance with the fierce determination of a mother wolf protecting her den. The villagers who had chosen to stand with them proved that courage could be found in the most unexpected hearts. Fishermen who had never raised weapons in anger now stood firm against seasoned raiders, and craftsmen who worked with wood and stone discovered they could work just as skillfully with steel, but it was Einar who drew every eye and held every breath as he stepped forward to meet the champions that each army had put forth. The royal sword gleamed in his hand like captured sunlight, while the ancient shield seemed to drink in the morning light and reflect it back as something purer, more radiant. He was no longer simply a boy playing at being a warrior. The sacred artifacts had transformed him, or perhaps revealed what had always been within him. Prince Magnus himself strode forward to accept the challenge, his own blade naked in his hand and his banner streaming in the dawn wind. He was a man in his prime, scarred by battle and hardened by years of warfare. But when he looked upon Einar, He saw not an easy victory, but something that made him pause with uncertainty. "You are just a boy," the prince said, though his tone carried more question than statement. "Do you truly understand what you risk in this trial?" "I understand that some things are worth any risk," Einar replied, his voice carrying a certainty that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than his years. "Do you?" Earl Gunnar the Red pushed forward, unwilling to let his rival claim the honor of single combat. "I have the stronger claim," he declared. "My armies hold the field, and my right comes from strength rather than distant bloodlines." But the Viking raiders' leader, a grizzled warrior called Thorvald Skullsplitter, laughed at both pretenders. "Rights come from the gods, not from the mouths of ambitious men. Let the boy face all three of us if he dares. Let the shield and sword prove their worth against honest steel." The suggestion horrified the watching villagers, but Einar nodded slowly, as if he had expected this very challenge. "So be it. 3 champions, 3 claims, 1 trial. Let the gods judge who is worthy." What followed was not a battle in any conventional sense, but a dance of destiny that seemed choreographed by powers beyond mortal understanding. The shield moved to block attacks that should have been impossible to anticipate, turning aside blades that came from blind angles and absorbing impacts that should have shattered any normal defense. The sword struck with precision that owed nothing to training and everything to some deeper harmony between wielder and weapon. Prince Magnus fell first, not to Einar's blade, but to his own recognition of unworthiness. As their weapons met, something passed between them, a judgment that had nothing to do with skill at arms and everything to do with the purity of intent. The prince lowered his sword and stepped back, his eyes wide with understanding. "The crown does not belong to me," he said simply. "The gods have spoken." Earl Gunnar the Red proved more stubborn, his greed and ambition driving him to continue the fight, even as it became clear that mortal weapons could not penetrate the divine protection that surrounded Einar. But greed made him careless, and carelessness in battle was always fatal. He fell not to any spectacular display of swordsmanship, but to a simple thrust that found the gap in his guard when anger overcame his reason. Thorvald's Skullsplitter lasted longest, perhaps because his motivations were the most honest. He sought neither throne nor legitimacy, merely the test of strength against strength. But even his brutal honesty could not match the power that flowed through the sacred artifacts, and eventually he too yielded. Casting down his weapons in acknowledgement of defeat, "The boy fights with the god's own blessing," he declared to his men. "We came for treasure, but we have found something worth more than gold, a true king, chosen by powers older than memory." The battle's end came not with trumpets or victory cries, but with a strange quiet that settled over the field like morning mist. The 3 armies, so recently locked in vicious combat, now stood in awed silence as they witnessed something none of them had expected: the emergence of a king, not through conquest or inheritance, but through divine selection. The crystal crown of truth emerged from its hiding place like a star fallen to earth, its surface cut from a single massive gem that seemed to contain entire worlds within its crystalline depths. This was the final piece, the ultimate test that would reveal the true nature of every soul it touched. As Gunnar lifted it reverently from the deepest vault, the crown caught the morning light and transformed it into something that burned with inner fire, casting rainbows across the walls of the ancient chamber. "This is the crown that cannot lie," the old guardian said, his voice heavy with the weight of 40 years spent protecting this moment. "It was crafted by the dwarf smiths in the world's youth, blessed by Odin himself, and worn only by those whose hearts contained no shadow of deception or selfish ambition. Many have tried to claim it, but the crown reveals truth whether the bearer wishes it or not." The assembled armies watched in fascination and growing unease as the crystal crown was brought forth into the dawn light. Even the most hardened warriors stepped back instinctively, sensing that they were in the presence of something that transcended mortal understanding. This was not simply a piece of royal regalia. but an artifact that could judge the very souls of those who approached it. Prince Magnus, though he had already acknowledged Einar's worthiness in combat, found himself compelled to approach the crown one final time. As he drew near, the crystal began to glow with a soft inner light, and images formed within its depths, scenes from his past that revealed both his noble intentions and his hidden doubts. The crown showed his genuine desire to restore peace to the fractured kingdom, but also his pride, his willingness to compromise principle for expediency, and his fear that he lacked the strength to bear the weight of true leadership. "I'm not worthy," he said quietly, stepping back with tears in his eyes. "The crown shows me what I truly am, and I find myself wanting." Earl Gunnar the Red, wounded but not yet dead from his trial by combat, crawled forward to touch the crystal surface with one trembling finger. The reaction was immediate and terrible. The crown blazed with angry light as it revealed the corruption that had eaten away at his soul like acid. His greed, his cruelty, his willingness to break any oath for personal gain, all of it was laid bare in images that made even his own men turn away in disgust. "No," he gasped, trying to pull his hand away from the crystal surface. "I deserve the crown. I have the strength to take it." But the crown had already passed its judgment. The light that blazed from within turned cold and harsh, and the corrupt earl's body began to convulse, as if the very touch of divine truth was poison to his corrupted soul. He died there, his hand still pressed against the crystal, his face frozen in an expression of horrified understanding. Thorvald Skullsplitter approached with the curious fearlessness of a man who had never pretended to be other than what he was. The crown's light grew warm and golden as it touched him, revealing a soul that was brutal but honest, violent but incapable of deception. The images within the crystal showed his raids and battles, but also his unexpected moments of mercy, his loyalty to his men, and his adherence to the harsh code that governed his warrior's life. "The crown finds no great evil in you," Gunnar observed with surprise. "You are what you claim to be, no more, no less." "Aye," Thorvald replied with satisfaction. "I'm a killer and a thief, but I'm an honest killer and thief. That counts for something, I suppose." But when Einar approached the crystal crown of truth, something unprecedented happened. Instead of revealing hidden flaws or secret virtues, the crown began to resonate with a pure, clear tone, like the ringing of a perfect bell. The light within grew brighter and brighter, until it seemed that the crystal itself had become a miniature sun, casting away every shadow and illuminating every corner of the watching souls. The images within the crown showed not Einar's past, but his potential future, a kingdom reunited under wise rule. The scattered treasures gathered and used to restore prosperity to the land. The ancient oaths fulfilled and the gods' anger appeased. But more than that, it showed the cost of such achievements, the weight of responsibility that would press down upon his shoulders, the difficult decisions that would test his wisdom, the loneliness that came with absolute power. "The crown accepts you completely," Gunnar whispered, his voice filled with wonder. "Not because you are perfect, but because you understand the true nature of kingship, that it is not a prize to be won, but a burden to be carried." Einar lifted the crystal crown of truth with hands that trembled not from fear, but from the awesome responsibility he was accepting. As he placed it upon his head, the crystal surface seemed to merge with his flesh, becoming not an ornament, but a part of his very being. The light that had blazed so brightly settled into a gentle radiance that seemed to emanate from within him, marking him forever as one chosen by powers beyond mortal comprehension. "I accept the crown and all it requires of me," he said, his young voice carrying the weight of ages. "I swear to rule justly, to protect the weak, to honor the gods, and to restore the kingdom to its former glory." The three armies, so recently locked in bitter combat, now knelt as one before their new king. The divine selection had been witnessed by all, confirmed by artifacts whose power none could deny. Norway had found its rightful ruler at last, not through conquest or inheritance, but through the oldest and truest method of all, the judgment of the gods themselves. The simple wooden cup sat on the rebuilt hearth like a reminder of humble origins, its plain surface worn smooth by countless hands that had lifted it in friendship, celebration, and quiet contemplation. Made from honest oak by some long-forgotten craftsman, it possessed none of the jeweled magnificence of the royal treasures, yet somehow it seemed to hold greater worth than all the gold and silver that had been unearthed. From the ancient hoard, 6 months had passed, since the morning when 3 armies knelt before a 14-year-old boy who wore a crystal crown and carried the blessing of the gods. The hall that had been a ruin now stood proudly restored, its timbers gleaming with fresh oil and its hearth crackling with the warmth of a true home. But the greatest transformation was not in the building itself, but in the lives of those who dwelt within its walls. King Einar, though he insisted his friends still call him simply Einar, sat by the fire with his mother, sharing the evening meal that had become their daily ritual of peace amid the chaos of ruling a kingdom. The crown rested on the mantle above them, its crystal surface reflecting the firelight in patterns that seemed to pulse with gentle life. The royal sword hung nearby, ready if needed, but no longer the constant companion it had been during those desperate days of siege and battle. "Do you ever regret it?" Freydis asked, as she served him bread and honey from the wooden cup that had become their favorite drinking vessel. "The weight of the crown, I mean. The responsibility of ruling." Einar considered the question with the thoughtfulness that had always marked his character, though now it was tempered with wisdom earned through hard experience. "I regret the necessity of it," he said finally. "I regret that the kingdom was so broken that the gods felt compelled to choose a boy as their instrument of healing. But regret the choice itself? No, this is what I was meant to do, Mother. I can feel the rightness of it in my bones. The kingdom was indeed healing, though the process had proven slower and more complex than any of them had anticipated. The scattered royal treasures were being gathered from their hiding places, brought forth by guardians who had waited decades for this moment. Each cache revealed new wonders, ancient artifacts that spoke of Norway's glorious past, but also maps and documents that revealed the intricate web of alliances and obligations that bound the realm together. Prince Magnus had proven invaluable in this process, his knowledge of court politics and diplomatic protocols, helping to navigate the delicate negotiations required to reunite the fractured kingdom. He had accepted the role of chief counselor with grace, his earlier disappointment at losing his own claim to the throne transformed into genuine enthusiasm for serving under a king he believed was truly chosen by divine will. And even Thorvald Skull-Splitter had found an unexpected place in the new order, his honest brutality making him surprisingly effective as a military commander. "The lad fights like a god and thinks like a scholar," he had told his men. "Following him feels less like serving a king and more like serving destiny itself." The village of Ravensfjord had become the unlikely capital of this restored kingdom, its simple buildings expanded and enhanced, but never losing their humble character. The great hall that had once belonged to a dissolute minor jarl now hosted councils where the fate of nations was decided. But it remained at heart the same, structure where a mother and son had once shared simple meals by a rebuilt hearth. Gunnar Ironbeard, whose true identity as Gunnar Eriksson had been revealed to all, served as the kingdom's chief guardian, overseeing the protection and proper use of the recovered treasures. He had aged visibly during the months of transition, as if the burden he had carried for 43 years was finally taking its toll now that it could be safely set aside. But his eyes held a satisfaction that spoke of duty fulfilled and trust honored. "The other kingdoms are beginning to take notice," Freydis observed, as she refilled their cups from the simple pitcher that had served them throughout their restoration of the hall. "The Danish king has sent ambassadors, and word comes that the Swedes are reconsidering their territorial claims in the eastern provinces. Let them take notice." Einar replied with quiet confidence. We seek no conquest beyond our rightful borders, but neither will we yield what belongs to Norway by ancient right. The crown has shown me visions of what this kingdom can become, prosperous, just, secure. I mean to see those visions made real. The conversation was interrupted by a gentle knock at the hall's great doors, not the urgent summons of crisis, but the courteous announcement of expected guests. Astrid entered with a group of children from the village, their faces bright with excitement and their hands full of wildflowers gathered from the forest meadows. "For the Queen Mother," the smallest girl announced solemnly, presenting her bouquet to Freydis with the serious dignity that children brought to important occasions. Freydis accepted the flowers with appropriate ceremony, though her heart swelled with quiet joy at the simple gift. These children had grown up during the chaotic months of the kingdom's restoration, witnessing wonders and terrors that would mark them for life. Yet they remained children still, capable of finding magic in simple flowers and joy in small kindnesses. "Thank you," she said, arranging the blossoms in the wooden cup that sat beside their hearth. "They're beautiful." As the children scampered off to other adventures, Einar watched his mother with the fond expression of a son who had learned to see his parent as both family and friend. The wooden cup holding the wildflowers seemed to glow in the firelight, its humble beauty a perfect complement to the royal treasures that surrounded them. "This is what it was all for," he said quietly. "Not the gold or the crown or the power, but this, children who can grow up in safety, mothers who don't have to fear for their families, simple kindness shared between neighbors. The wooden cup holds more real wealth than all the royal hoards combined." Outside, the wind off the fjord carried the scent of growing things and the sound of honest laughter from the village. The kingdom was at peace, the treasures served their rightful purpose, and a mother and son shared the quiet satisfaction of a task completed and a life well lived. In the end, that was treasure enough for any heart.